We want to kick off this morning with a very important topic. We have two very distinguished speakers here this morning to address an issue that I think is very important to many of us in the state of Kansas, but that being the High Plains Aquifer. And we have with us today Jim Butler and Bert Griggs. They're going to talk about the current challenges and promising paths forward. The High Plains Aquifer in Kansas has been heavily pumped for decades to provide water for irrigated agriculture. In this presentation, Jim Butler of the Kansas Geological Survey and Bert Griggs of Washburn Law will discuss the current conditions in the aquifer and the prospects for extending its lifespan and the food supplies in local communities that it supports. They will end with a brief discussion of what sustainability might mean in the context of the High Plains Aquifer in Kansas. And I was just visiting with Jim. He said if you have questions, feel free to ask them. Otherwise, we can keep that toward the end. Yeah. So if you absolutely need to ask a question right away, go ahead. But if you can't, try to save it for the end. So let's welcome Jim Butler and Bert Griggs.
Okay, can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a privilege to be the first speaker, to be followed by Dr. Griggs from Washburn Law, one of the noted water lawyers here in the state of Kansas, and I think he'll be able to show what it all means in kind of a legal context of what I talk about here as a lead-off speaker. As Nick said, I'm Jim Butler with the Kansas Geological Survey. For those of you who don't know the survey, we're a research and service division of the University of Kansas. We have no regulatory or policy-making function. Our mission, when you cut to the chase, is to provide a sound scientific foundation on natural resources issues within the state for the decision makers at all levels of the government in the state to utilize so that we can have decisions that are based on sound science. And obviously one of our most important natural resources here in the state of Kansas is our groundwater. And so that's what my colleagues and I focus on at the Kansas Geological Survey, or the KGS. As we're known, we are on West Campus at KU, so we are Jayhawks, okay? So it's good to have the basketball season starting. Okay, so with that, let's go forward. And which screen would you prefer that I focus on? The right or the left? So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
The left.
The left, okay, yes. The left. So, what I'll do is I'll give some introductory material, and then I'll start focus on the High Plains Aquifer. So, start off on any talk that I give on water resources here in the state. I always start with this map, which is just showing the great variation in annual precipitation we have here in Kansas. Everyone in this room knows that we go from as low as 18 inches a year in far southwestern Kansas to over 46 inches a year in the extreme southeast portion of our state. And as a result of this strong variation in precipitation, there's a strong variation in water, where we get our water here in Kansas, and that's illustrated by this next slide showing the variation in the source of water across the state. Red is groundwater, blue surface water, and similar to the precipitation, you have this east to west variation. Now notice the gray shaded area in this figure, that's the High Plains Aquifer. But before we get focused on the High Plains Aquifer, I want to just have some introductory comments about aquifers in our state. And just give me a minute. I was going to keep track of my time here, and I forgot to start my time. So I'll have to adjust so I give Bert plenty of time. So, what is an aquifer? Well, in Kansas, Our aquifers basically are piles of sedimentary particles, particles ranging from clay to gravel, and they're not cemented together. You just got this big pile of particles. Now, there can be, I mean, it can be a few hundred feet in thickness, and so near the bottom, this stuff is being compressed. The groundwater resides in the space between the particles. So you're talking about, a couple of millimeters being a large space there in the aquifers in Kansas. And we call these aquifers unconsolidated aquifers. So they're not cemented together as you would see with rock aquifers. So this is what we have in Kansas, whether it's the High Plains Aquifer or elsewhere. Most of our groundwater is coming from these unconsolidated aquifers. The water's in these small spaces of pores, and as a result, it moves very slowly because of all the friction that involves with the water movement. And it's only in the immediate vicinity of a well where we've set up a big pressure gradient that the water moves rapidly. So typically, when we think of groundwater movement, we're thinking 1 to 3 decades to move a mile. So it takes a long time for the water to move in our aquifers. So, where are our aquifers in Kansas? Well, the best way of depicting that is with this figure here. This is a map of all non-domestic pumping wells, all non-domestic wells that have a right to pump groundwater. And notice the concentration of wells there in western and south central Kansas. That is the High Plains Aquifer. But notice that there are also these bands coursing elsewhere through the state. These bands are alluvial aquifers. These are aquifers that underlie the floodplain of our major river valleys. And so you can see there in northeast Kansas, you've got this band here, that's the Kansas River alluvial aquifer. However, the big player in our state is the High Plains Aquifer. And so now I'm going to focus on that, and we'll begin with just this general slide. High Plains Aquifer, I think many of you know, is one of the world's most important, it's one of the world's largest and most important regional aquifers in terms of the agricultural production it supports. It covers parts of 8 states in the central U.S. as shown on this map. We're going to focus, obviously, here on Kansas, and it's the tan portion of this figure there, this inset, that's the High Plains Aquifer. Now, this aquifer has been pumped for decades in support of irrigated agriculture. It's been heavily pumped for decades. That intensive use has come at a price in terms of aquifer conditions. And I'll illustrate that price with this figure. This is the percent change in aquifer thickness since the onset of widespread pumping for irrigated agriculture. So that would be the late 40s and the 1950s here in Kansas. The blues in this map are areas of aquifer increase. Everything else, aquifer decrease, with the deepest reds being areas where over 60% of the aquifer has been lost since the onset of widespread pumping. I should note in this map, the blues in the western 40 to 50% of this map, those were thin aquifer from the get-go and not of practical significance. So, you can see we've had significant declines in our water table, particularly in the area of western Kansas here, which we call the Ogallala portion of the High Plains Aquifer in Kansas. Now, we've had more. The impact of these intense water level declines is beyond just what we see in this map. Hydrologically, there has been heavily impacted is our surface water bodies. And this is a slide I just put in yesterday. I didn't have time to get the latest figure. It's been an update to 94, but this is a map of the changes in perennial streams in Kansas since 61. And the update, the situation has not improved since 94. And what you see here is that our streams and rivers in western Kansas and the perennial streams and rivers have disappeared over this time period. The reason is they were groundwater fed waterways. This happened because the water level in the aquifer was higher than the water level in the stream, so water flowed from the aquifer into the stream. We've drawn down the water level in the aquifer. It has dropped below the bottom of the stream. So as a result, water has flowed in the opposite direction, and our streams have largely dried up. And you can see that this is the Arkansas River there. It comes in, we have a healthy flow from Colorado, but by the time it gets to Garden City, it's over, and it hasn't flowed. It doesn't flow again to, a time maybe to Pawnee confluence with the Ark Channel there at Larned, but it's typically closer to Great Bend that it starts up again. There's two factors here. First, they've got these irrigation companies there west of Garden City that divert water, surface water canals, and put it on use it for irrigation, mostly north of the Ark and west of Garden City. And everything else just seeps in to the aquifer because that's the direction water flows. The water table is now quite a bit below the level in the streams. So the result is this is a common view of many of our former waterways in central and western Kansas. This actually is at a research site we have just southeast of Larned in central Kansas, where we've done a number of studies as part of our work at the Kansas Geological Survey. So I just wanted to show you that it's more than just declining water tables. There have been these other impacts, and the decline of our perennial streams is just one of those. So let's return to this map. From this, you can see there in western Kansas, in the Ogallala Aquifer portion of the state, that we've had significant water level declines. We've got a number of areas that are facing very significant challenges now because of declining groundwater supplies. Continuation of business as usual is not going to end well. So, what can we do to diminish the rate of water level decline in western Kansas? Well, there's no excess surface water to be had in western Kansas, as I think everyone knows. Now, many of you may have heard about the idea of taking water from Missouri and shipping it out in an aqueduct there in western Kansas. Now, the Kansas Geological Survey does not take positions on such projects. And I know that there's a range of views on the merit of that proposal. Regardless of your view, I think we can all agree on one key point, and that is it's not happening anytime soon. And I would define soon as 40, 50 years, the lifespan of the vast majority of people in this room. And Dr. Griggs can provide further details of that, I'm sure, with questions based on similar projects here in the U.S. and elsewhere. So, what are we going to do? Well, we have one option, frankly, that is to reduce pumping. And that is, then the question becomes, how much do we need to reduce pumping to have a significant impact on the water level decline rates? And that's what we were charged with figuring out at the survey. And we are very fortunate here in Kansas that we have the data that enable us to come forward with reasonable, reliable predictions of what to expect if you decide to reduce pumping. And the reason for that is we have 3 data sets that I just wanted to give a quick overview for this group. And these data sets enabled us to glean insights into aquifer conditions that folks elsewhere in the United States just don't have the ability to do. And first, every year in January, the Kansas Geological Survey and the Division of Water Resources in the Kansas Department of Ag, we send out teams to measure water levels in a network of approximately 1,400 wells across the High Plains Aquifer. And we have been doing this for decades. So we have a good idea how water levels have changed over time. And it's these data that enable us to make maps like that percent change in decline map I showed earlier. Now we understand from these data how the water levels have changed. Now those changes are driven by stress to the system. And that stress is the pumping of groundwater. And this is where Kansas shines. We have, this is the map I showed earlier. This is a map of all non-domestic pumping wells with the right to pump groundwater in the state of Kansas. Producers are required to have a totalizing flow meter on their pumping wells. And they're required to report that amount annually. That is highly unusual. Elsewhere in the United States, and frankly, globally, Kansas is the world leader in terms of water use information. That's something that my colleagues and I, the survey, feel we're very fortunate to have our predecessors in the water resources community here in the state had the foresight to understand if we're going to manage a resource, we have to know how much we're using from it. And it seems like a very simple concept, but I tell you that most states are largely in the dark in terms of exactly how much they're pumping, and the same goes for developed countries elsewhere around the globe. So we have annual water use data. So we have, every year we get a water level measurement from that 1,400 wells, and we have all the information about how much is being pumped out of the aquifer. Those are just once a year measurements. So there's limited amount that we can do with that data. So that led us to set up a third, to get a third data set. This is what, with the KGS Index Well Program, beginning back in 2007, we set up a network of wells, which is now 30 in number, and these are these green plus signs on this map. Now, each of these wells has a continuous water level sensor in it. We're taking a measurement of water level position every hour. And every few hours, in 25 of those wells, that information is sent via telemetry to the KGS website, where it's freely available. People can view it in near real time. And it's those data, that hourly data, enabled us to glean insights into aquifer conditions. We could take those insights and utilize them with annual water level and water use data, so we can develop new methods for estimating how much bang folks are going to get for their buck in terms of reductions of water use and the decline rates. And this was an important advancement that we were able to make a survey, and the reason we were able to do that was because of the data that we have here in Kansas. So we can tell folks, if you want to reduce pumping so much, this is what you can expect in the near to moderate terms, in terms of water level declines. Now I'm talking years to a few decades. This is what you can expect. So we have a tool. Now, if we're going to have an impact on the regional decline rates, we're going to have widespread reductions in pumping. There's a few areas it's not going to do it. It's going to have to be widespread. So how can you do that? Well, the Kansas legislature, with the help of Dr. Griggs, I should note, came up with new management frameworks that encouraged groundwater use reductions. And I think many of you may be familiar with these. This is the Local Enhanced Management Area, or LEMA program. And I should note that Dr. Griggs was the primary author of that statute, so I'm very fortunate to have him in the audience today. And also the Water Conservation Program. The LEMA program, the legislature set that up in 2012, and a few years later, the Water Conservation Area program was set up. The idea for both of these, but I'll focus on LEMA in this talk, is that we're giving the producers a tool for conservation that has a flexibility component as well. So let's talk about the LEMA, this Local Enhanced Management Area program. The idea here is a group of producers get together and they say, hey, we want to reduce water use by X%. Everyone formally commits to that. And then the regulatory agency comes in and makes sure that everyone's playing by the agreed upon rules. So it's a combination of grassroots-driven proposals supported by regulatory oversight. And what the commitment is for 5 years at a time. So you're given a total volume of water that you can use over 5 years, and you can kind of distribute it as you see appropriate during that period. And there's some more rules requiring it, but that's kind of the basic of the program. So currently, we've got 3 of these LEMAs in this state. The first one set up in Sheridan 6, that's just west of Hoxie. There in Sheridan County, it's 99 square miles. The area was set up in 2013. Now the success of that area led to the establishment of a LEMA for the entire groundwater management district there in northwest Kansas. That's groundwater management district number 4. It's about 4,600 square miles area. They got rolling on LEMA in 2018. Now then, Wichita County in west central Kansas, they started the LEMA in 2021. However, prior to that, they had water conservation areas in a portion of the county. That began 2017 to 2018. So the question is, how have these areas done? How have they been able to actually reduce groundwater use? So I wanted to take a look at that. We'll start off with Sheridan 6, which has been in operation again since 2013. So the question is, have they reduced water use? So my colleagues and I came up with a very simple way of evaluating that. And I'll show it on this plot here. What I'm plotting here on the y-axis is just annual water use. On the x-axis is precipitation. So the idea is each one of these points is for a particular year. This is how much water was used in that year, and this was the precipitation. And the blues are the pre-Lima period. That began in 2002 in this plot. The red is Lima data. These red plus signs. That's from 2013 to present. The idea here is for similar climatic conditions, similar precipitation, how much water use, how much was pumping reduced. And it turns out that it was reduced approximately 30%. And their goal was 20%. And so I think this speaks volumes about the commitment of the producers in the Sheridan 6 area, that they were able to achieve this. And I'll talk about the requirements of the Lima in more detail, but there's 2 hydrologic requirements, and there's a 3rd economic requirement. I mean, can you still make money by doing these reductions? And I'm not an economist, but the ag economists at Kansas State did an analysis of this, working with the producers in Sheridan 6, and determined that they made just as much during the Lima period as they had in the pre-Lima period. So they were able to use methods of precision agriculture, just common sense, to reduce their pumping and still have it not impact their bottom line. And so this has had this has generated enthusiasm about the Lima program elsewhere. So let's go to Groundwater Management District number 4, started their Lima in 2018. Now they had much more modest goals with their initial 5-year period, and it's reflected in this plot. The red stars are their Lima period, and you really can't statistically state that they have saved the water, that they've conserved water as a result of the Lima. Particularly when you consider that 2018, which is furthest from the pre-Lima data, was a year where they had some hailstorms that took out the crops in certain areas in May of that year, so it's artificially reduced the quantity. So they have not had, they're not showing that same degree of reduction as we saw at Sheridan 6. And we're hopeful that in the future they will begin to have more ambitious goals and we'll begin to see a difference appear. Let's go down to Wichita County. This is an area where they had these water conservation areas start in 2017, 18, and the Lima started in 2021. So we can't really say much about the Lima since it's only been since 2021, but you can see as a result of these water conservation areas that you're getting a similar kind of divide between the Lima and pre-Lima period. Now I'm plotting here depth of applied water in this case. So this is a plot showing they improved the water efficiency, and in this case, the water use efficiency by about 26%, which is low. Now, 2 things. One, it's unfortunate that in this area, they have very little aquifer to work with. The average aquifer thickness is probably 30 feet or less in this area, which it's unfortunate that these programs started. It would have been better for them to start 10 or 15 years earlier to give them more of an opportunity to really utilize them well. But efficiency improvements. Burke and I gave presentations to a combined Kansas Senate House Water Committee at the end of August of this year, and that's why Nick heard us and asked us to give something similar to this group. Now, in that presentation, I got asked by one of the senators, can't we just do it with efficiency? We all just use more efficient methods for irrigation. Won't that solve the problem? Well, this flies in the face of 150 years of economics research in the area of natural resources economies. They have known since the 1860s that just improvement of efficiency does not necessarily lead to a reduction in the use of that resource. Oftentimes it ends up you're using more of that resource. And they call this Jevons paradox. You increase efficiency, but you use more of the resource. And we've looked at how much water has been conserved in the period from like 96 to 2016 in northwest Kansas. There were big improvements in efficiency of water use in that period, but we don't see any impacts on these plots like this when we look at the 96 to 2016. And the reason is folks were saying, okay, I'm using more efficient methods. I now can grow more water-needing crops and irrigate greater land area. So if these efficiency measures are very useful if there's a cap, such as in a LEMA or a water conservation area. They can help folks meet the goal of those areas, but just efficiency alone is not going to do it. So, let's return to Sheridan 6. As I said, there are two hydrologic requirements of a LEMA. One is you have to reduce water in the Sheridan 6 LEMA. The second and most important requirement is that you reduce the rate of water level decline, because that is ultimately the purpose of the LEMA. You want to reduce the rate of water level decline so you can extend the lifespan of the aquifer in your region. So at the KGS, we've been able to develop some new theoretical methods to look at this. And this is just one of the plots that resulted from those methods. This is average annual water level change in the Sheridan 6 area there on the y-axis. This is annual water use in the area on the x. The circles, black circles, are pre-LEMA down. The green plus signs are LEMA down. So you look at it on the x-axis. This just verifies what we saw in the previous plot. They're clearly using, if you look on the x-axis, they're clearly using less water in the LEMA period. Go to the y-axis, this again is an annual water level change, and you can see they're clearly have reduced the level of water level declines. And it turns out they've reduced it by about 56%. So this is adjusting for climatic conditions. So the water use, and reductions that they got as a result of LEMA activities has resulted in 56% reduction in the decline rate. They still are losing about 5 inches of aquifer per year. They would need to cut it by about another 13% to achieve that. Now, according to this theory that we developed, once you do these groundwater pumping reductions, these annual water level changes for the next years to a few decades should fall on a straight line consistent with the pre-LEMA data, and you can see that they did. The reason is the aquifer has not yet adjusted to the conditions that are now existing with the reduced water use. So that you're putting less water on the surface, so less irrigation return flow back to recharge the aquifer. You've reduced the decline rate in the area, so there's less of a drive of water from outside regions into the Lima area. Eventually, the aquifer is going to recognize that conditions have changed. We don't know the timing of that. And when that happens, what you'll see is with the same pumping, we're now getting more water level decline as the aquifer adjusts to these new conditions. And that's a sign that further reductions are necessary. So just one round of water use reductions is likely not going to get it done when we're talking on the time scale of decades. Further water use reductions will be required. But we will know when those are needed because we have got this approach that allows us to see when the aquifer starts adjusting to these new conditions. And again, this is a result of us having these 3 data sets that enable us to glean insights into our conditions. So, what I'm trying to focus on here, trying to stay within time, is water quantity investigations. And our recommendation is if we're going to reduce the rate of decline, we've got to have these limas and water conservation areas spread across the High Plains Aquifer, particularly in western Kansas. But I wanted to talk just a minute about groundwater quality. I'm not a groundwater quality expert, but I just wanted to have this group understand that the Kansas Geological Survey is doing a lot of work on groundwater quality as well. I'm just not the guy who can tell you like the nth degree of detail on that. But just a quick word of general water quality in the High Plains Aquifer. It's generally good in western Kansas. As we go into south central Kansas, we start getting some problems with natural chlorine, salt water, natural salt water coming into the aquifer, obviously limiting its use for irrigated agriculture. We also have contamination, saltwater contamination of our aquifers due to oil field brine, inappropriate disposal of oil field brines, and across the aquifer there are nitrate challenges, as I think most of you know. But I wanted to draw your attention to an area here around Garden City. Notice this is a light tannish area indicating that this area there with this ellipse has seen relatively small water level declines, despite this being an area with lots of irrigated agriculture. The reason is they've got these irrigation canals, surface canals, that take water from the arc and bring it out to the fields. So they have, as long as that flow across the border with Colorado continues, we will have, this area has the potential to be sustainable in terms of groundwater quantity. The issue is that water we're getting from Colorado, the quality is not what we would prefer. And I just wanted to real quickly cover that. So what I've got here, on the x-axis, we're basically looking at the Arkansas River and the water in the Arkansas River, because this is the water that is put on those fields. And we're beginning at the Front Range and going all the way to Great Bend here on the x-axis. And I'm plotting 2 quantities here on the x, the y, excuse me. The upper plot is sulfate in milligrams per liter. And sulfate, the Environmental Protection Agency does not have the maximum contaminant level. They recommend if it's above 250, you might have taste issues, could be some laxative issues, but really in terms of health, there's not a problem. Of course, if you get above maybe 1,500 or so, it's not going to be viable for agriculture, simply because of salinity issues. So you can see what happens there on the top sulfate as you move downstream from the front range. You can see the sulfate building up until it gets closing in on 2,000 milligrams per liter there as it crosses the border into Kansas. Let's look at the lower plot. This is uranium. And notice, in this case, the EPA has set a maximum contaminant level of 30 micrograms per liter on uranium. And notice that that has been significantly exceeded as you move downstream. And it gets to, what is that, Lamar or so there in Colorado, you're above the drinking water maximum contaminant level. You hit the state line, on average, the groundwater, the water quality of the Kansas River, as it crosses into our state, the uranium concentration is 2 times the maximum contaminant level for drinking water supply set by our Environmental Protection Agency in the U.S. Now, the survey, my colleague Don Whittemore has developed an approach that allows him to estimate uranium concentrations from a much simpler analysis for sulfate. And so we have, at the state line, the United States Geological Survey has a sensor that gives us information about the sulfate in the water, the concentration of the sulfate. Don can use that to calculate how much uranium is going across the state line. And we've got a fair amount of uranium coming across. The top year was 2017, where you had 10 tons of uranium coming across the state line. The average over the last decade plus is probably 6 tons of uranium. Where does that go? Well, that goes onto the land surface there, through the canals, applied on the land surface, or it just seeps into the aquifer to the bottom of the river or the irrigation canals. We are building up concentration of uranium both on the soil and in our aquifer there in that region. And I think long term that has serious ramifications for the area north of the Arc and west of Garden City, which otherwise one would say they have a very good chance of being sustainable for decades to come. I just wanted to throw one plot up here, talk about this a little bit more. This is uranium on the y-axis, sulfate on the x, and the blue line is the river water quality in the Arc. And this is, Don, my colleague, has fit a straight line to this that enables him to calculate uranium from sulfate concentrations. 2 well fields here. Lakin, you can see the points there for Lakin. The Lakin well field exceeded the maximum contaminant level, in which case, when that occurs, the community is required to put in a treatment plant as it's exceeded this maximum contaminant level. And they did at a great expense to the community. And that will continue. Other communities there in the area will be facing this same issue of having to deal with it. Now, Garden City, much larger, it'd be easier for them to handle the cost there. Also, they've got a well field south, a few to several miles south of the Arc that makes it a little easier for them to deal with. So, I just wanted to mention that one area. So, in summary, we have significant challenges in our aquifer, the High Plains Aquifer. Now, we have a promising path forward with these LEMA water conservation areas. Now, years like this significantly stress that. This map is a recent drought monitor map, and this shows the challenges that we face and are continuing to face this year. And our aquifers are not immune from those challenges. And so you can imagine, drought conditions, folks are going to pump more. So how can we prepare ourselves for future, what sort of measures can we put into action so that future droughts have less of an impact. And I just wanted to again emphasize our best approach is to reduce pumping, like they've done in the Sheridan 6 area. Because what that does is that enables us during drought conditions to use less water, and during average to wet conditions, we can bank significant quantities of water that can help extend the lifespan of the aquifer and give us a reservoir that we can draw upon to help us get through difficult conditions. And with that, I'm going to bring this presentation to a close. For those of you wanting more information about the High Plains Aquifer, the survey we have is High Plains Aquifer Atlas, Digital High Plains Aquifer Atlas. The web address is given there, but I know what you're saying. You're saying, Jim, how am I going to remember that? The Kansas Geological Survey is here for you with our highly coveted High Plains Aquifer Atlas refrigerator magnet. So I will put these out as well. With that, I'd be happy to just acknowledge some of our funding resources. Feel free to drop me a line if you want further information, and I'd be happy to take a few questions. So thank you for your attention.
So what's the source of the uranium? What is the source of the uranium?
Uranium is naturally derived. So it's in the shales that underlie the aquifer, the underlying aquifer in eastern Colorado. So they're naturally derived, then they're concentrated by the irrigation activity there in eastern Colorado, sitting in those shallow reservoirs like John Martin. You're getting a lot of evaporation there that concentrates it. So my colleagues estimate that it concentrated about 3 to 4 times as a result above the natural levels as a result of human activities.
Sulfate, the same way as it naturally occurring?
Yes, all of this is naturally occurring.
Then, one other point I was going to ask, like the Hoxie Lima or whatever, the Sheridan County. Have you ever put together, do you have a graph that would go back, and if we had done nothing, what things would look like? So I know you kind of did in a way, but
Yeah, well, we certainly have looked at it and said, okay, this is the decline rate over the last, say, 10 years. And business as usual would just be basically to extend that into the future. And so we've come up with an estimate that they had maybe 20 years left based on those patterns.
so what happens in a year like this, because I'm from Pawnee County,
Right.
I'm a recovered irrigator, I don't irrigate anymore. But there was a tremendous amount of water banking, or people applied to water bank.
Right.
I mean, like probably at least 10 times as much.
Right.
Does that still work when that many people do it?
Well, I talked to Warren Farrell, who's the manager of GD5. I think he runs that water bank too, and they've recognized that they're going to need to modify the water bank because of they just hadn't been realistic about what would happen. I was on the group that reviewed that, and we did mention that as a possibility, but that was just a recommendation on my question.
Does Kansas have any priority or rules of preference for water?
Well, the speaker who could go into that in great detail will follow me, Dr. Griggs. But the answer is yes. But I'll let Dr. Griggs talk about it because he'll be able to convey the subtleties that I will screw up.
Are there incentives to joining these Lima groups? And if not, it seems like you've shown great progress with those groups. Why aren't there?
Well, I think there's a feeling that folks want to reduce risk. And if you're reducing pumping, that may not be the most risk minimizing activity. But the guys in Sheridan 6 they are driven by a strong sense of, this is my impression now, of preserving the resource for future generations. They say, hey, we had this lifestyle, we like it a lot, we want our kids, grandkids, and the future to have a similar experience. And the only way that's going to happen is if we step it up and say, we're going to make a difference during our launch. So I think that's the motivating factor. And to be able to show that they can do it and make just as much money, then, you know, the price of water, I mean, water is going to be more valuable as we move into the future because it's going to be a scarce commodity. So they're really well positioned, I think. And I think that's, so if you look at long term, it's a good move. But of course, short term, you can see how folks might question its viability in terms of its impact on the bottom line. That's why we need the economists, the ag economists in Kansas State to give us some assessment of that impact.
It just seems insane that we're considering building this huge viaduct to ship it across the state and the amount of resources that would go into that, but we're not going to consider
Well, I would say that
incentivizing
folks
people to use
in
less
northwest
water.
Kansas and west central Kansas have recognized that they've got to do something, and they can't wait for something that's going to be 60 years down the line,
Right.
if ever. And Dr. Griggs is much better versed
Great.
in talking about the potential for that ever occurring. You got a question?
Is the primary recharge of the aquifer from precipitation above or lateral from where the formation's outcrop against the front range?
Oh, there's very little coming from the front range.
Okay.
Primarily, I mean, when you think of an aquifer, it's best to, what was that ad campaign that Las Vegas had? What happens in Las Vegas stays in, well, you know what I'm talking about. Well, the same thing happens. You need to have the same philosophy for aquifers. It's all about the local situation. This groundwater is moving so slowly that it's right now in our area. So you've got a combination. You've got the water coming in from the surface. Now, at the survey, this is an active area of research for us. But one of the questions, we've got a heck of a lot of these playas there in western Kansas. What is their role in the recharge? And anecdotally, you hear that they're a major player, but we need to have a better basis for our assessment of their role. So that's an area that the survey is involved in. We also have looked at the role of farm impoundments along these gullies, these drainage areas, and it's clear that when water is impounded behind those small dams, that it is recharging the groundwater. We have a well that's within it's within a quarter of a mile, maybe it's less, from one of these impoundments, one of these continuous monitored wells. When it fills up, we can get the water level rise by 7 feet, which is an indication they're getting recharged. But elsewhere in the aquifer, on these continuous wells in western Kansas, we don't see a signal of recharge in those wells. So it takes a long time to get down there, and as it goes down, everything gets smoothed out. So we can calculate an average rate of net inflow into the area. We're still trying to figure out exactly where it all is coming from.
On the Colorado side, what are they doing, or are they concerned, or is there any issues?
Well, I'm not an expert on Colorado. Again, a follow-up speaker has more information about that. I think they recognize the challenges. They have the added issue is front range cities are trying to buy up water rights in eastern Kansas, so that eastern Colorado, excuse me, so that they can take them to the front range and use them. Anything else?